Just to run through the basics very, very quickly, you've seen graphs like this all over the place. You know that over on the left there it shows you average increases in temperature. And what we have here with this top line is the kind of small-scale changes happening over the last few years. That black line at the bottom is where ordinary temperature projections would have taken us had there not been this anthropogenic, this man-made addition to natural background forces. So this is the sort of stuff that lies behind it. That led, of course, amongst other things, to the consensus from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the body set up by governments to advise governments, which in 2007, in its fourth assessment report, steered government towards this kind of science consensus. Absolute consensus that we shouldn't let the temperature increase by more than an average of 2 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, which means that we'd have to move towards stabilization of greenhouse gases at around 450 parts per million. And then from there, you can cascade that through to the level by which you'd need to reduce those greenhouse gases to ensure stabilization at around 450. And here in the UK, as you know, we have a long-term target of an 80% reduction in those greenhouse gases by 2050. I'll come back and say a bit more about that in a moment. Very strong consensus about this. Big question mark now whether this consensus is any longer quite as robust and helpful to us as we would like it to be. Some of you may have seen at the end of last week and earlier this week some of the latest data about CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere over the Arctic. Now, you have to be careful about this particular piece of research from the Norwegian Polar Institute because people recognize that CO2 concentrations are higher at the polar extremes, and this particular figure, which they surfaced recently, is the highest that we've ever seen. So CO2 in the Arctic in the last few weeks has gone as high as 397 parts per million. The upward curve here is extremely worrying. Essentially, between about 1970 and 2000, concentrations of CO2 grew by about 1.2 parts per million per annum. And since 2000, they've been growing by about 2.1 parts per million per annum. This increase is closer to 2.5 parts per million as an annual change since the last year. This is not a good story. This is heading very, very rapidly in the wrong direction. So let's get serious about the language behind this. Please stop talking about things like CO2 mitigation. Language much beloved of governments, large companies. It isn't helpful. It sort of gives you the slightest indication of the nature of the challenge ahead. But really, we have got to start talking about systemic, radical, accelerated decarbonization as the only proper, responsible response to the science that we now have available to us. Anything else is linguistic fudge at best and blatant dishonesty at worst. That's the middle of the conundrum we're in now. The science should be driving policy, which should drive behavior change. The gap between science and policy is large, and the gap between policy and implementation is even larger. So you all know what we're here for today, which is to bridge these gaps, to get what we do aligned to the science that we have available to us. Now, to be fair, our politicians are responding to this. We see a progressive attempt to raise the policy bar, to make people more aware of what's going on here. Very important Climate Change Act, first country in the world to have a statutory encoding of these targets. 34% cut by 2020, that's the figure that the government has now signed up to. And as we'll see over the next few weeks, the likelihood is that both opposition parties will go along with that 34% target by 2020. We will be the first country in the world to have complete cross-party consensus, both about a long-term target, 80%, and a medium-term target, 34% by 2020. So why is it that so many very intelligent people all over the place continue to ignore the full implications of an 80% cut? What is going on? How does this happen? when you arrive at a state where science is almost completely consensus-based, where politics is almost completely consensus-based, and you've still got a few problematic issues going on. I refer to this as my Jeremy Clarkson moment of homage. Jeremy Clarkson, to me, is the single most problematic issue when it comes to increased public awareness and understanding. Because with people like Jeremy Clarkson out there still casting a veil of confusion over everything, we are still in trouble. Happily, of course, we don't just now need to use the usual suspects to counter Jeremy Clarkson. I just want to pay tribute to the work that the CBI is doing here because it's important. The CBI's report last year changed the ground rules for members of the CBI who hitherto had been accustomed to a level of mediocrity that you can barely believe. Now we have the CBI actively, proactively on board, bringing its members into a state of something resembling awareness. So, on to the second of my tasks today, which is to launch this new initiative, the West of England Carbon Challenge. We're working very closely here with BITC and absolutely delighted to share today with BITC and all the other organizations. For us, it's extremely important that what we do now is absolutely joined up. Nothing would be more problematic than lots of diverging initiatives, disappearing over here, a bit over there, something going on over there. Should I listen to that person? Should I listen to that organization? What are we meant to do about this? So for the last year, we have been discussing with businesses and public sector organizations and NGOs across the whole of the West of England how best to inject some additional energy into this area, working with the Mayday Network, working with BITC, working with all the other organizations in this space. So happily, we have here the organizations that are now the founders of this West of England Carbon Challenge. Really important for us that we're able to bring this together. Essentially what we're calling for is not terribly surprising. We're backed now by our supporters, and we're also backed by a large number of organizations that are starting to get on board. What are we trying to do? Extremely simple. We're going with the overall target base for the Mayday Network, so reductions in CO2 by at least 10%, and spot the wording, it's quite important, by at least 10% by 2012. And I can assure you that the pressure will grow to do more than that, but we all have to start somewhere, okay? So at least 10% by 2012. That's a sort of encouraging downward trajectory, but as you can guess, it doesn't quite get us aligned with the science as I've laid it before you today. It's a network which will share best practice, which will use the exemplars and the success stories of other members of the network to sow that understanding around the network as a whole. There'll be specific professional support, advice for anybody that gets involved in this to share that learning and to undertake their own reductions against that kind of target. And it is, as I say, specifically designed to be as joined up as we possibly can. We're starting recruiting for members today to get involved in this. We've already got some founder members who've come on board, and absolutely delighted that we're now going to be able to share this kind of journey with so many really crucial organizations. Public sector, private sector, NGOs. Very grateful to all our partners for helping to get this to the point where we are today. And we have great hopes that this is the kind of practical implementation of a lot of what we're talking about through the Mayday Network. Because we have to somehow actually notch those percentage reductions, not go on talking about them. We have to deliver them, and that's always the tricky bit. So that's it really, a bit of a belt on the doom and gloom around the science. Sorry about that, but you know, the science doesn't sit there waiting for us to get our act together. Climate systems, frankly, consider the impact of humankind to be relatively immaterial one way or the other. Jim Lovelock believes that they'll see us off whether we do anything or not. I believe we've still got a chance to align ourselves with those natural systems and come out at the end of this low-carbon journey in a much, much better place than we are today. But as Mark Twain reminds us, if we don't get to move on with this tomorrow, rather than the day after tomorrow, we may look back and think, we missed our moment, didn't we? Thank you.